Well, analogy is this wonderful tool in our language. Analogy in some ways is the poet's paintbrush. We can take something that's very abstract and very difficult to describe, and we can make it accessible and vivid and rich and full of meaning by connecting it to something tangible, a physical experience, something that we have felt with our five senses. Well, a few months ago, I just happened to stumble upon some analogies written by high schoolers, and I thought I might share a few with you this morning. First one is, her face was a perfect oval, like a circle that had two sides gently compressed by a thigh muscle. The ballerina rose gracefully on point and extended one slender leg behind her like a dog at a fire hydrant. She grew on him like she was a colony of E. coli and he was room temperature Canadian beef. Her thoughts tumbled in her head, making and breaking alliances like underwear in a dryer without clean free. Sometimes analogies are just downright bad. And sometimes analogies are a little too vivid. But sometimes analogies are works of art that capture something beautiful and something true. Something so meaningful that hearing or reading them doesn't leave us the same. It moves us into some new space. In fact, sometimes they are so true that they are able to capture something of the human experience so fully that it becomes a part of our everyday language. For instance, think about incredible beauty. Beauty is this abstract concept, right? And it's very hard to describe. Yet when we encounter it, we know it. It elicits a very strong emotional response in us. Well, how do you describe that? Somewhere along the way, a poet, an artist of words, someone who is deeply in tune with human emotion, noticed that sometimes when we witness something incredibly beautiful, it's a similar response to when we are scared or spooked. It so catches us off guard, and so captures our full focus and attention, that we stop breathing. Our breath catches in our throats, or our jaw drops open. And so we have these expressions in our language today: breathtaking beauty, jaw-dropping beauty, to describe something indescribable, the abstract and the very subjective experience of powerful beauty. Well, the poet we hear from today tries to describe the overwhelming experience of longing for God. And like incredible beauty, it's quite hard to put into words. Whoever the poet of the 63rd Psalm is, this poet is a scholar of both the human soul and the human body, because they magnificently weave the two together in an analogy in a way that creates deep and powerful meaning for us. They talk about longing for God, the way the body thirsts for water. And not just any thirst, but the kind of thirst when you're wandering in an arid desert landscape and there's no water in sight. Now, I wonder how familiar we are with that kind of thirst. You see, the picture that a poet paints with their words and with their use of analogy it's only as powerful as the sensory experiences that the listener brings to it. Now you see, you and I, when we skip a meal, we feel that gnawing, growling beast come to life inside. And when we go for a long walk out in the Florida heat and sun, we feel that dry throat, body melting kind of thirst. That's the kind of hunger and thirst I think we imagine when we hear this soul. The kind where as soon as you get home and you're able to finally eat or have that ice cold glass of water, you wolf it down and guzzle the water down. It is the kind of hunger that can make us a bit hangry. You heard that phrase? Hangry. That kind of crankiness we get when we're hungry. That's what I think most of us imagine when we hear this song. But there is another level of hunger and thirst that some of us Americans have never experienced, though some of us have all too often. It's the kind of hunger and thirst that the Israelites might have experienced when they were wandering out in the desert, the kind that Jesus likely experienced during his 40 days in the wilderness of fasting and praying. It's the kind you feel when you don't just skip one or two meals, but when you go several days without food, or all day without water. I'm no expert in fasting, and I can't say that I've done a lot of it, but I have fasted for up to 48 hours, and oftentimes when I was fasting, I was leading groups of teenagers in a fasting experience. And so I would be sitting there telling them over and over again, drink your fluids, drink your fluids, drink your fluids, and of course forget to drink my own. So I've got just a small taste of what this deeper hunger and this deeper thirst might feel like. It's the kind where the gnawing and the growling in your stomach gives way to sort of a cloudy, fuzzy feeling in your head, and your response time slows, and you feel weak, and you move around at about half pace, and your head gets achy, maybe even gets filled with splitting pain, and you might even get lightheaded or pass out. It sort of feels like you're walking around half asleep, and your body has to put all of its energy into just the basics. I think that might be a little closer to what the psalmist is describing. After all, the psalmist talks about fainting. And I don't think they're talking about the Pentecostal being slain in the Spirit, falling to the ground that we may have seen in some churches. I think they're talking about something that is so necessary for life that we give out without it. Our longing for God is like walking around feeling half asleep and craving and needing God's life-giving Spirit to revive us so that we can live fully aware and fully awake in this world, fully functioning. The psalmist does us this wonderful service here in the way they describe this longing, because we don't always have words to describe that aching or that craving or that longing we feel for the deep of the deeps. There is a phrase out there right now, spiritual but not religious, which usually refers to non-churchgoers, but not always. It is a phrase about people who are on a quest, about people who feel this deep craving, this need, this thirst for something deep and true, for something eternal and meaning-making. But they aren't finding it in most of the churches they go Interestingly enough, we heard from a number of such people over the last few weeks. When we put out our sign about white privilege and racial equality, as a number of you know, we received a lot of media attention, and a lot of people have been writing in with emails and on our Facebook page. And Kelly Daniel wrote on our Facebook page, "I've never been, but I'm seriously consider going here. A church that promotes activism and speaks against injustice is exactly what this world needs." Another person wrote, "I'm not a person of faith, but I'm so incredibly proud of the space you are carving out in your community. It is a beautiful thing to hear of you opening your doors in hopes of fostering a stronger community." And yes, I'm aware that we received lots of negative comments as well, and this was just a few of the positive ones. But what I'm hearing is that we struck a nerve for some people. That our message of justice and our message of speaking truth to power, of taking a risk for love, that spoke to the thirst inside some people for what they hope and long for God and the people of God to be about in the world. We don't always know what exactly it is we're craving or thirsting for. But when we find it, we know it. Each week we say something here at Good Sam. Wherever you are in life's journey, you are welcome here, and we really need it. That's a phrase that comes directly from the United Church of Christ, one of our two denominations here at this church. And one of the things that I love about the United Church of Christ is that we don't tell you what it is you are meant to be thirsting for. We let each other journey, and we journey alongside each other, and we discover together what it is we're thirsting for. Because we know and we trust that there is a powerful experience inside each of us, just like thirsting for water. And we don't always know that we've found what we're looking for until we come out of that foggy, weak, sleepwalking-like state, and we begin to live more fully alive in the world. And I have to say, as pastor, it's beautiful sometimes to witness when the community altogether discovers a way that it's thirsty and starts to drink deeply and come more fully alive. I've only been here a year and a half, but I have seen that among you many times. Well, Lent is a time when we are particularly intentional in our journey in trying to listen to our spiritual thirst. And here's the thing, as Barbara Brown Taylor describes in her book, An Altar in the World, you can find living water almost anywhere. You can find it in a mirror. You can drink deep from God's grace and your Creator's love as you let God redefine your self-image. Some of us find living water in a mirror. You might find it in the silence and the solitude of your bed at night, or a dream even, as you welcome in God's challenge and call and a new way God might be leading you. You might find it in the face of a stranger, as you learn to detox from not enough and begin to share as if you had an abundance. You might find it in the words of Scripture, or a beautiful novel, or a painting, or a poem, or a song. Our thirst for God can take us to a lot of different places. And if you've ever fasted or gone without water for 48 hours, finally reintroduce water, you have to start with small portions. And then you gradually introduce more into your system. And there's no wolfing or guzzling. Instead, there's just a slow, gentle savoring of each bite. I wonder what communion would taste like to those who had been wandering, weak and weary, hot and tired, dehydrated and headachy. How would that bit of bread and that small sip of drink enter the body? I wonder how you are thirsting for God right now in your life. I wonder where living water is tucked away behind this rock or that in the wilderness you travel right now. And I wonder what it would mean to come fully alive again. The psalmists and the prophets and Jesus, they all echo the same message all throughout our gospel and our scripture stories. The well of God's living water does not run dry. The well of God's living water does not run dry. Jesus, as you know, spent much of his ministry trying to get people to discover and explore their own thirst for God. And when we meet him today, a number of Galileans, Jesus' own people, have been murdered. And something heinous has been done with their blood. It has been mixed with the blood of the animal sacrifices at the temple. This is something that would have been deeply, deeply offensive to the Jewish people. And in response to this horrible thing that has happened, the people do what people have done for as long as we have collective human memory. They try to make sense of this tragedy, this offense, this profaning of their holy, by beginning to wonder if this is God's punishment. If the water has dried up in the well of God's love and God's grace for them, if they have been left out in a spiritually arid place with no water in sight. And then, of course, they do something even worse. They begin to imagine that perhaps it's just those who died these awful deaths, who must have done something terrible to deserve it. You know, it sounds a bit like how people responded to AIDS victims in the 1980s. Now, Jesus is probably pretty frustrated. He has been going around and telling people about God's living water, and it just isn't sinking in. Even his own disciples don't get it most of the time. And we hear over and over again in the Gospels, we can almost hear the, you have little faith. So in the midst of so many fears and so many worries about God's well of love drying up for this people, Jesus tells the crowd a story. And it's a story about a fig tree, which isn't producing fruit. Someone has planted it, and there's a gardener who's watering and caring for it, who's providing for its thirst and providing nutrients. But the plant still isn't producing fruit. So the one who originally planted it gets fed up and says, okay, let's cut it down. But the gardener who has watered it and who has nurtured it, let him nurture it even more. And the owner concedes. this one is hopeful and patient. And I wonder if our story of the fig tree went on even another year, or another year, what this conversation between the gardener and the owner would look like. Sometimes we hear a parable like this, an analogy for God's kingdom, and we think that one of the characters in the story must be God, and then all the rest are human beings of some sort, right? But I wonder in this story if what we're really getting a glimpse of is this internal dialogue of God. God the Creator talking with God the Christ, or God the Spirit, and together moving in a direction. Moving in the arc of love in which God always moves. From scarcity to abundance. From judgment to grace overflowing. Sometimes our fears leave us living in that place of scarcity and judgment. Sometimes we ourselves fail to follow the arc of God's love with our own thirst. We fail to move into grace after grace and into second chances. Over and over, the Bible is clear. The people of God, people feel that God has abandoned them, given up on them, that the well of God's love for them has dried up, that there's no living water in sight. But then God sends a prophet, or the Christ, or the Spirit. And like the gardener digging that trench around the fig tree to draw water and nutrients closer, like a mother whose child won't nurse, God keeps trying. Because we aren't meant to move through this world spiritually dehydrated. We're not meant to move through this world slow and weak and achy, but alive and energetic and renewed and refreshed. As Sarah Bessie, who we watched one of her videos in our Faith Film Information Lenten series this morning, as she says, Lent is the time to detox from not enough. It's the time to tune into our thirst and make our way to the streams of living water. May God be with us on this journey. Amen.